Hello and welcome to Islam in the Middle Ages, a series for IHSHG examining the Islamic world from Muhammad to the Mughal Empire on the first Sunday of each month. In our last episode, we looked at the rise of the Mongol Empire and the way that it totally disrupted life in the Islamic world, overthrowing old powers and bringing in a new network of kingdoms ruled by the descendants of Genghis Khan. We tracked their lightning fast rise and fall, and how, for a short time, they created an extraordinary network of tolerant, interconnected states and helped to revive arts and culture across the Islamic world. Today, we'll examine the rise and fall of the most iconic figure to emerge from the collapse of the Mongol Empire, a warlord named Timur, who was as infamous in the medieval Islamic world as Napoleon or Julius Caesar is in the West, who founded a century-long dynasty that dominated the Islamic world in the 14th and 15th centuries. This episode will chart Timur's meteoric rise to power, as well as the extraordinary legacy he left behind, including some of the Islamic world's most ambitious buildings and artwork. We'll see why he punished a rival warlord by locking him in a birdcage, how he built gardens made in the image of paradise itself, and how an extraordinary book known as the Rainbow Quran came into being. This will also be a handy episode for introducing the so-called gunpowder empires from the 16th century onward, powerful and enduring dynasties that took on much of Timur's culture and political ideas in the formation of their own culture. His is an incredible story, and one that I'm excited to be diving into with you today. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the IHSHG, and I would like to thank them for giving me the platform to be able to host this. Do be sure to check out their website, Facebook page, and YouTube channels for more historical discussions in English and Portuguese. This episode also marks 1 year since the start of Islam in the Middle Ages, and I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to everyone who has supported the podcast so far. I've been genuinely amazed at how many people have taken an interest in the Islamic world through my podcast, and I'm enormously grateful to everyone who's listened and fed back to me. Thank you so much to you all, and I do hope that you'll continue to enjoy our episodes as we continue to explore all that the medieval Islamic world has to offer. And with that, let's dive into the story of one of the most extraordinary characters in the history of late medieval Asia. Timur is considered by many scholars to be the last great conqueror of the Middle Ages, who tried to rule an empire that stretched across the cultural and geographical boundaries of Asia. His territory was sizable, stretching from Iraq to India, and he managed to carve this out in the space of just 25 years, and when warfare in this period was at its most intense. He's therefore seen as an impressive conquering figure, and one of the last to attempt a truly pan-Asian imperial project before the post-medieval age cemented territories along the lines we recognize today. It's also worth mentioning that because of this, he's a highly controversial figure. For some, he's a ferocious hero and a conqueror of the same magnitude as other great world leaders, people like Alexander the Great or the generals of the early Roman Empire. In Uzbekistan, for example, he's considered a national treasure, with a sizable mausoleum and imposing bronze statue in the city of Samarkand. For others, though, he was a sadistic tyrant who laid a trail of destruction in his wake and threatened entire cities and even countries with his vicious streak. He's often depicted as one of the major villains in the history of Georgia, for example, as well as regions in southern Iran and northern India that he laid to waste. Needless to say, he's a highly contested figure, and trying to study him can be challenging, given the broad and often partisan spectrum of opinions about him. I'll try to bring out both of these sides within this episode, so you can see for yourself what makes him so controversial, and form your own opinion about what to make of this figure. Timur was born in 1336 in southern Uzbekistan. It was around this time that the four Mongol states were collapsing, leaving chaos in the wake of the ailing empire. This was exacerbated by the fact that around the same time, the Black Death was tearing through the Islamic world, killing between a third to a half of the population it reached. As such, he was born into a highly fraught period, wherein the power vacuum created, a string of short lived dynasties rose and fell, and power could be lost as easily as it was gained. If our sources are to be believed, in spite of his noble upbringing, Timur began life leading a group of bandits, stealing horses and sheep. Over time, this grew into a substantial raiding band and eventually an army, allowing Timur to offer his services as a mercenary to the unstable dynasties around Persia and Central Asia at the time. In 1362, his first big break came when he allied with a young lord named Amir Hussein, helping him to carve out territory around the city of Samarkand in Central Asia, an ancient capital of Silk Road trade and an enormously wealthy prize for an enterprising warlord. Things got off to a rocky start initially. Timur was roundly defeated and imprisoned for several months in a vermin-ridden cattle shed. Eventually, though, by the mid-1360s, the two emerged victorious, taking an enormously wealthy area of the Silk Roads for themselves to govern. As was often the case, though, in this period, the alliance proved fragile. In 1365, Timur parted ways with Hussein, and shortly after that, relationships between the two deteriorated into tit-for-tat fighting as Timur began to build his own base of power. Things came to a fore in 1370, when Timur took control of the city of Balkh, administering on behalf of a puppet ruler related to Genghis Khan, which was, at the time, the qualification for rulership in the wake of the Mongol Empire. This was a huge deal. Balkh was an ancient and wealthy city that was, before its collapse, the capital of the Chagatai Khanate. It was believed to have been founded by Alexander the Great in his conquest of Persia, and was home to a number of enormous cultural icons of the Persian world, including the prophet Zoroaster, who founded the pre-Islamic religion of Persia, and Rumi, an enormously influential Sufi and poet from the mid-13th century, who in this period had distinguished himself as both a cultural treasure and foremost thinker on Sufi theology and practice. It was therefore a highly significant city, and by taking control of it, Timur was sending out a powerful message about his particular ambitions and the confidence he felt for conquering territory. This was further reflected in the way that he had his entourage refer to him as World Conqueror, reflecting the ambitions that he held at the time. It was Timur's intention to follow in the footsteps of the mighty Genghis Khan and forge an enormous empire that stretched across the entire width of Asia, and if he could, the broader world beyond. Spurred on by the taking of Balkh, Timur spent the next 10 years building up his power base, attracting talented soldiers, and amassing wealth and resources to facilitate further conquest. He also had Hussein assassinated, who by now had become enormously unpopular with the people that he ruled. Then, from 1380 to 1405, he unleashed what was then the biggest army in Central Asia on the Islamic world, sweeping through major cities like Baghdad, Antioch, and Damascus, and taking them for himself. In the 1390s, he challenged and defeated the powerful Rajput clans of northern India, families with a reputation for military success and fierce independence in the face of external conquerors. Like the Mongol warlords before him, this was a lightning-fast campaign that allowed Timur to build up a network of loyal city-states in an astonishingly short period of time. And like the Mongols before him, he adopted a dual policy towards those he conquered, showing mercy to those who surrendered, and viciously destroying cities of those who resisted. The secret to Timur's success was a mixture of his armies, tactics, and his formidable vision that propelled his followers forward. His army were professionals, divided into infantry, cavalry, and artillery like a modern military force, alongside horse archers and elephants, two of the most potent military assets in the world at the time. Timur was also a tactician par excellence, often using deception and trickery to give him advantages in the field. A source from his conquests of Persia even details how he made a numerically superior force flee by lighting fires at night and kicking up dust by day to make his army seem bigger and more fierce than it in fact was. He also had a tendency to pay off or convince mercenaries to turn on those who hired them, and to exploit divisions between his enemies, as we're about to see. All of this was underpinned by Timur's leadership. If our sources are to be believed, he was enormously popular amongst his own men, and had both a vision for success and a remarkable quality for inspiring and leading others, granting him in turn a devoted and loyal fighting force. En route, he also secured a number of impressive, and I have to say vain, titles, such as Unconquered Lord of the Seven Climes, Shadow of God, and Lord of the Auspicious Conjunction, to further bolster his image as a powerful, successful leader that others could get behind, earning prestige and wealth as they went. He also revived the old Turkic title of Ghazi for his own purposes. This had originally referred to the warlords leading Turkic raiding parties, but took on a meaning in this period of a warrior leader, fighting for the cause of Islam against its enemies. It was a seal of military excellence, rather like the knightly titles of Europe, and by being declared Ghazi, it cemented Timur's reputation as a military leader par excellence. Taken together then, this made him an enormously successful military leader, who had a relatively unbroken string of victories over the 25 years that he was an active campaigner. The conquests only stopped in 1405, when Timur passed away whilst out in the field. This was a truly impressive record, and one that, in my opinion, squarely places him in the traditions of leaders like Saladin and the early Rashidun Caliphs for his breathtaking speed and energy. Timur's most infamous victory would come, however, in 1402 at the Battle of Ankara, in what is now eastern Turkey. He was provoked into conflict by a rival warlord, who too was amassing a sizable empire with an army of well-trained Turkic soldiers. His name was Bayezid I, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, a new and rapidly growing power in the Levant, Turkey, and Southeast Europe. Bayezid was a successful military leader, but possessed something of an arrogant streak, provoking rival leaders by slandering them and invading their territory. Timur initially ignored the threats that Bayezid leveled against him, but when he began to threaten Timur's holdings in Persia, he decided to take action. The battle itself was a disaster for Bayezid. He arrived disorganized and arguing with his generals, and his Mongol mercenaries even defected to Timur's side before the fighting began. Timur also poisoned Bayezid's water supply, and aggressively overran his infantry with volleys of horse archers, gradually wearing down the Ottomans to a bitter defeat. In victory, though, Timur was willing to forgive and forget, treating Bayezid well and offering him the position of governor in his own lands, so he wouldn't resent the defeat. Bayezid, though, was a sore loser, and spitefully turned down Timur's offer, continuing to be highly rude to him even after he decided to let the matter go. What happened next has gone down in legend. Timur imprisoned Bayezid in a large birdcage and forced his wife to serve his table naked during banquets. This endured for several months until Bayezid got sick of the treatment and took his own life by dashing his head on the bars of his cage. This crushing defeat and the capture of a ruler threw the Ottoman Empire into disarray as Bayezid's successors fought to take control of the young power. Interestingly, though, this provoked an overwhelmingly positive reaction from the Christian princes of Europe, who had watched with some fear as the Ottomans advanced into European territory. For them, the Ottomans were proving a frightening, unstoppable power that trampled over Christian kingdoms without any sign of defeat. Multiple crusades that had been launched against them had failed. And so, when another, even more fierce warlord came along and defeated the Ottoman army, The response from Europe was one of gratitude. It was also, however, one of deep anxiety. Timur was a largely unknown power, and it was feared that if he could defeat the Ottomans, he would be an even greater threat to the Christian powers of Europe if he chose to invade. It's worth remembering, too, that the last time an unknown power had come and defeated enemies of the Christian world, it was the Mongols, defeating the Turks in the Crusades. So it's quite understandable that the rulers of Europe were keen to placate and thank this new power that had emerged in the region. The Byzantine Empire in Greece sent tribute to him, and several kingdoms, including Spain, France, and England, sent embassies to his court, giving him a network of tributaries that stretched across the entire length of Eurasia, as well as a sizable landholding that included the Middle East, Iraq, present-day Iran and Afghanistan, large parts of Central Asia, and even going down into northern India. Despite this remarkable record, though, it's genuinely hard to know what to make of these conquests and what they say about Timur. His behavior, although enormously violent by the standards of the present day, was still very much in line with other aggressive military leaders in this period. And what he did to secure his rise to power was, frankly, no better or worse than anybody else in this period. Raiding and destroying cities was part of the cut and thrust of medieval Persia at the time. He also did allow cities to govern themselves once they surrendered, and helped to bring in wealth and artistic patronage to those who joined his cause. That being said, it's hard to overlook the damage that he did, and would be irresponsible to do so. Timur would destroy entire cities that stood against him, sometimes even attacking fellow Muslims to advance his personal aims. This was an enormous taboo in the Islamic world, as one was only meant to attack fellow Muslims if they were seen to be going against the Quran and Hadith, and wars in this period had to be justified through this lens. Understandably, therefore, Timur's reputation is grim even today in areas that he laid to waste. He also committed some truly horrific acts in his conquest, building pyramids of skulls in conquered cities, setting mosques ablaze, and catapulting the heads of prisoners of war at enemies during sieges. I think this is important to keep in mind, as we can often run the risk of sanitizing military conquerors as heroes who shape the course of history, without recognizing the very real damage that they can do. And it's worth remembering too that whilst Timur's record is impressive, there is a good reason why he's not received well in some parts of the world. These are two very different ways of seeing him, and it can be difficult to reconcile them, but I think it's for the best. Figures like him in history are often complex and multifaceted, and whilst it's nice to have a simple, consistent narrative about a person and their life, it doesn't do justice to their reality. Timur is a hero in the eyes of some, and an irredeemable killer in the eyes of others. And that is something that deserves to be respected and shown fairly. That being said, it's that in my opinion, also makes him a figure worthy of study and discussion. Timur was not just a military conqueror, though. He was also an avid artistic patron and architect, who fostered a flourishing of high culture in the cities he administered. Timur had a particular taste for large, grand constructions, and commissioned some of the most structurally impressive buildings in all of the Islamic world. The most prominent of which was the palace of Shahrisabz in his hometown of Kesh. At 73 feet high, it was one of the largest palatial constructions in the Islamic world, with towers that could be seen up to 25 miles away. Furthermore, Samarkand in this period welcomed an enormous variety of artisans, paving the way for innovations in ceramics, sculpture, painting, woodwork, metalwork, and glass. Timur was also a big fan of murals, and commissioned a number of enormous painted scenes on walls, depicting military victories and scenes from the Shahnameh, an enormous epic poem from Persian culture that chronicled the rise and fall of ancient kings. Rather like the Iliad or Odyssey in the Greek world, it was designed as both an account of epic adventures and a teaching point for future kings and educated individuals. And in the Islamic world, it gained enormous popularity from the 11th century onwards, when an updated version was written by the Persian scholar and author Ferdowsi. Returning to the politics of empire, though, in 1405, after Timur's death and a brief power struggle between his successors, Timur's fourth son Shahrukh came to power. I'll pause here to briefly mention a quick point about power struggles in later Turkic empires like the Timurids, as this shines an interesting light on the culture of royal succession within these dynasties. It was considered quite ordinary for sons to fight amongst themselves after the death of a ruler, with the intention that the most tenacious one would eventually come to power. This was a surprisingly common feature amongst powers that succeeded the Mongols. In fact, in the Ottoman Empire, this was codified into law until 1603 and proved an unusually effective way of producing a strong succession of sultans. This method, of course, carried risks. If the conflict continued for too long, it could fracture the state and split it into warring factions, something that outside rivals could take advantage of if things weren't settled fast. And of course, any conflict of this sort would have a ruinous effect on individual towns and communities, and can do serious damage to ordinary people and their livelihoods. That being said, this proved an unusually good way of deciding the most effective ruler, especially if the situation was contained and didn't spiral out into all-out civil war, as often the most shrewd, resourceful, and militarily talented individual would rise to the top. The length of the reign of some Timurid rulers, especially compared to other leaders in this period, is testament to the fact that this could produce some good, strong, and stable leaders, and Shahrukh was certainly no exception to that rule. Upon coming to power, Shahrukh moved the capital from Samarkand to the city of Herat in Afghanistan, where he served as governor prior to taking the imperial throne. He was an exceptionally long-lived ruler relative to this period, presiding over 42 years on the throne. Due to this relatively long and stable rule, he was able to oversee a number of key artistic and economic reforms over the course of his reign. The empire reached new heights of wealth, owing to a steady taxation of Silk Road goods that once again began to flow into the region with renewed energy as the bloody 14th century drew to a close. To capitalize on this flow of goods, Shahrukh implemented a standard form of taxation across the Timurid Empire, as well as a system of landholding where loyal agents to the empire could take land for themselves in return for regular contributions to the imperial treasury. In addition to this, artistic and scientific patronage under Shahrukh soared to renewed heights, with a number of impressive buildings and works of art being produced with Timurid funding. The most frequent and generous patronage came from his two sons, Baysungur and Mirza Muhammad, as well as his wife and primary consort Gohashad. Given Shahrukh's sizable influence over the organs of state, the opportunities for his family to exercise power via politics was fairly limited within the empire itself. And therefore, in its stead, an opportunity arose to gain clout through patronizing scholarly arts, something the three generously funded, which, when coupled with Shahrukh's long and peaceful reign, allowed a number of impressive projects to be commissioned. Baysungur and Gohashad were artistic and religious patrons first and foremost. A number of impressive mosques and madrasas were commissioned by the two, including a madrasa exclusively for girls that Gohashad founded herself. Mural work also continued under the two, as it had in Timur's time, with a number of impressive scenes being painted and produced in this period. Baysungur also commissioned a sizable imperial library, as well as a book production center known as the Kitabkhana, for copying and illuminating manuscripts. This was an impressive operation, with 40 master scribes overseeing production, and under them, new types of calligraphy and gold leafing were produced, as well as illustration styles pioneered in the style of Chinese silk painting. Perhaps the most impressive specimen to come from the Kitabkhana was the Rainbow Quran, a remarkable book with each page in different color of silk and decorated with flecks of gold. I would heartily recommend looking this up for yourself, as it's a really extraordinary artifact and incredibly beautiful. The two were also serious patrons of gardens and public spaces, with a number of impressive urban green spaces being built in the twin imperial capitals of Herat and Samarkand. I'll pause here to briefly talk about Islamic garden culture, as it contains a number of interesting links to religious, cultural, and political life in the Islamic world. These gardens would often be walled off and accessible only to those who walked in to view them. As spaces of remarkable beauty, they were designed to be parallels to Jannah, or paradise, spaces of unparalleled beauty, hidden to all but the most devout believers. The gardens would be viewed from a raised terrace and arranged symmetrically in a pattern of greenery disrupted with flowers or sometimes fruit trees, as well as channels of water. The purpose of this was twofold. The raised platform was designed to give a purpose of ownership and mastery over the space below, and the neat arrangement of water and plants was designed to invoke both an image of the gardens of paradise, as well as an idea of mastery over the natural world, an image that, in Arab and Persian culture, was closely linked to good government and closeness to the divine, suggesting that they were able to order the natural world just like God did, showing in turn that they were God's deputy to rule over the earth below. To emphasize this point further, many gardens in this period also contained remarkable luxury items, such as silver trees that sprayed perfume through pipes, or larger palms covered in rings of gold. Taken together, these were beautiful, luxurious spaces that were designed to be both hidden gems in a ruler's palace and a place that reflected mastery and order over the earth below. Shah Rukh's other son was Mirza Muhammad, a man more interested in science and scholarship than art. Mirza helped fund a compilation of several comprehensive surgical texts by a prominent medical lecturer known as Burhanuddin Kirmani. Although many of these were refinements and replications of earlier theories, they nevertheless contained extraordinary details about a variety of medical functions, such as the working of nerves and the link between the senses and the brain. A number of astronomical surveys were commissioned by Mirza too, who had a personal interest in the field, as he'd been trained in maths and astronomy in Herat, with a view to becoming a scholar before ascending to the royal court. He funded 10,000 students in 12 institutions to this end, including a giant observatory in the city of Afrasiab, in the style of the one in Maragay that the Mongols had commissioned 2 centuries earlier. Here, a number of impressive breakthroughs were commissioned, such as a mechanical device for calculating planetary courses, a calculation of the number pi to a figure twice as comprehensive as it had been done previously in ancient Greece and China, as well as an early use of the decimal system for the first time. An enormous star chart, with the precise locations of nearly 1,000 stars, called the ZHG, was written too, the most authoritative pre-modern guide to astronomy, alongside the works of Ptolemy and the Renaissance scientist Tycho Brahe. Although the observatory was sadly disbanded in 1449 after Mirza's death, many of the scholars within it went on to study at further institutions. In 1474, for example, Timurid scholars set up an astronomy school near the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, after the Ottoman conquest of the city in 1453. Under Shah Rukh, therefore, the Timurid Empire enjoyed nearly half a century of peace and prosperity. Unfortunately, that was all about to come crashing down with the death of the ruler in 1447. As I mentioned earlier, power struggles for succession in empires like these were usually fine, unless they spiraled out into all-out war. Sadly for the Timurids, it was exactly that happened, as Shah Rukh's successors began to fight bitterly with each other for who would take the throne. What followed were 20 years of intermittent warfare between the different heirs to the throne, during which time the empire was assaulted by Turkic raiders called the Karakoyunlu, or Black Sheep, who took advantage of the turmoil to raid and pillage for themselves. Eastern Persia was also briefly taken over by a Sufi called Abu Sa'id, who ruled independently of the Timurids for a number of years, administering his brief territory reasonably efficiently before being defeated by the dynasty in the 1460s. Eventually, in 1470, a Timurid prince named Hussein Baikara came to power. He was able to restore some order to the chaos that had unfolded within the empire. Baikara presided over one final resurgence of Timurid arts and culture, led by a vizier named Nizaruddin Ali Shah Hawari. Hawari is an interesting figure in some ways, as he went against the grain of Timurid literary culture by commissioning texts in Turkish instead of Persian, raising Turkish to the same level as what had been then the major scholarly language of the region for some years now, comparable to Latin or Greek in the West. Hawari also founded a number of mosques, madrasas, a Sufi lodge, hospitals, and public baths, something that impressed the first Mughal emperor of India, Babur Khan, when he visited Samarkand nearly 60 years later. Hawari was also patron to Kamal ad-Din Behzad, a talented artist who pioneered perspective and naturalism, and produced some of Persia and Central Asia's most treasured silk paintings. Despite this prolific outpouring of art and culture, though, things began to unravel fast for the Timurids as the 15th century drew to a close. The empire's nobles, who had been given land in exchange for treasury contributions, began to fight over their holdings and attack each other for a greater share of the land, something that had become a serious issue of stability from the 1480s onwards. Things weren't helped either by the fact that within the imperial court, Hussein's sons were entirely unfit for statecraft, preferring to drink, hunt, and throw wild parties instead of seeing to the business of state, making it increasingly difficult for Baikara to effectively administer his country. As time went on, the empire became increasingly fragmented and disorganized, something that didn't escape the attention of various Turkic groups who saw an opportunity to sweep in and raid territory for themselves. One group in particular, the Uzbeks, were becoming increasingly powerful and organized in this period, just like Timur and his band were a century and a half earlier. In 1506, the Uzbeks swept into the Timurid heartlands of Central Asia, taking over their major cities and putting into motion a new dynasty that would last in this region over the next 2 centuries. At the same time, in 1501, the west of Persia was invaded by an aggressive Shiite army known as the Qizilbash, or Red Hats, owing to their distinctive headgear, who would go on to take over Persia and rule as a dynasty known as the Safavids. Their first leader, Ismail, would be crowned Shah, receiving an imperial title that had been unclaimed for nearly 1,000 years. These dynasties would go on to be lasting installments until the 18th century, and although they're a little outside of what constitutes the Middle Ages, I will nevertheless give them some attention in later episodes, as they're fascinating powers and well worth exploring. Despite this unfortunate end though, Timur's legacy proved surprisingly enduring, with all 4 of the major empires of the 16th and 17th centuries taking inspiration from him. His artistic and cultural commissions inspired works produced in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and Europe, as well as the Safavids in Persia and the Uzbeks in Central Asia. The Mughals, a Persian-speaking Turkic dynasty who went on to form an Islamic empire in India, even depicted themselves as heirs of Timur, requiring every emperor to prove themselves as a Ghazi in battle. Curiously, Timur even had a sizable influence further west. In 1587, Shakespeare wrote the play Tamburlaine, charting Timur's rise to power. This play is a little fanciful, and tends to exaggerate some of Timur's more maniacal tendencies. In one scene, it even depicts him as driving a chariot pulled by the kings he had defeated in battle. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see just how far his influence spread, and how this made him, in the eyes of both Europeans as well as those who lived under his rule, the model for the quintessential ambitious or indeed murderous warrior who sought to conquer the world, before the rise of modern figures such as Napoleon. Therefore, whilst he was short-lived, Timur nevertheless had an enormous influence on the cultural and political arc of the Islamic world. He was the last in a line of conquerors that tried to unite the whole of Asia under one ruler, and set in motion a series of politics and patronage that would be adapted and used by powerful, robust empires that sprung up around the 16th century as the medieval age drew to a close. In our next episode, though, we'll take a break from the usual timeline to examine the world of Persian literature, another vital area of culture that helped shape the 16th century empires to come. We'll investigate some of the most famous and celebrated poets of the Islamic world, and the writings that helped shape the culture and ideals of this period. This is easily one of my favourite topics to discuss in the Islamic world, and I'm excited to share that with you next time. Thank you very much, and see you in the next episode.